Oh, Mom. Thank you. Meet you. Steve. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
We're kind of in.
This is my former president.
We're kind of in the middle of the story. Okay.
I had confessions for the forthcoming Holy Communion, first Holy Communion.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I said, I can bring you as many bullets as you want. These are Civil War bullets that I dig up with a metal detector. And from other people, I find so much and call them up to Gettysburg and sell them. And they said, no, all they wanted was 5,000. And they said, well, when can you bring them? I said, I can bring them. I said, I can't do it this week because I'm on day shift. I said, I could bring them next week because I'm on the evening shift. I said, but I would rather do it the week after that if you can hold off that long because I'll be off the whole week. Okay. So we looked at a calendar and I had a 6-day break coming up on Thursday, November the 19th. This is 1998. So I loaded the truck up. Okay. I had on my digging clothes, holes in the knees. Okay. I was wearing my digging clothes.
Shoes. Shoes with holes.
Shoes with holes in them. Okay. I looked terrible, but that was just the way it was, and that's just the way I was. When I was in civil war relic mode, that's just the way I was. All right, and I purposely left a little early so I could stop at the Grotto of Lourdes in Emmitsburg to keep my promise to God and to Our Lady and Saint Teresa of Lisieux by saying that thank you. Okay, so I drive to the grotto, and that was my first stop. And I walk through there, same exact path that I had taken back on July the 3rd, first time I'd ever been up in there. And I got to the statue of Saint Therese and to the statue of Our Lady of Fatima. And I said, in prayer, I said, thank you very much. I said, as I know you already know, Christopher has been baptized, and I thank you for making it as easy as you did. I was expecting all kinds of grief. I was expecting all kinds of problems from the Southern Baptist side of the family, but I didn't get any. I mean, none. I got a few questions, but nobody, attacked me. And I said, thank you so very much. Okay, and then I was leaving, and I was gonna get in my truck, and I was gonna leave to go to Gettysburg. And then there's another statue of Our Lady. It's the Blessed Mother. She's laying down, she's just given birth to Jesus, and St. Joseph is standing over top of her, okay, with a staff in his hand. And right directly above, if you look up, is that tall golden statue of the Blessed Mother that sits 80 feet up in the air, okay? And you know how you can do something accidentally that's in synchronization with something else and it startles you? Okay, well, that happened. I reached out and I touched the hand of Mary. And at the instant that my finger made contact, I mean the instant the bell tower chimed off, and these are big, huge bells, and they're loud, and I'm right underneath of it, and it startled me, and I jumped back. It was just like an involuntary reflex. It startled me. I jumped back, snapped my hand back, and then I just laughed, and I said to myself, I couldn't time that again like that in a million years. Okay, and I just laughed it off. Okay, so then I get in my truck. I'm gonna head down 15 to go to Gettysburg, and I see the sign that says South Seaton Avenue. And I said, well, I've never seen the old town part of Emmitsburg. I've never seen that in my life. And I know South Seaton Avenue will take you through town, and it's got to bring you right back out on 15. And I'm still a little early. And so I decided I was gonna go down South Seaton Avenue. There's one traffic light. Well, at that time, there was only one traffic light in Emmitsburg. I had to sit there and I waited for that. And then I went through, and then it was sitting over on the right. It was the first time I ever saw St. Joseph's. It said St. Joseph's Catholic Church, administered by the Vincentians, home parish of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. Okay? And then it said established 1793, and the current building had been replaced there since the 1840s, maybe the 1850s. And I was still early, and I said to and when I drove by, I noticed something was going on, and I didn't know what. I saw two buses there at St. Joseph, walking in, walking out, and you could tell it wasn't a wedding, you could tell it wasn't a funeral. I didn't know what it was, but I parked my truck, and I walked up to the front of the church, and there's this guy, Joe Martin, sitting at the front door in a folding metal chair. And he said to me, he said, have you got a pass? I said, no. He said, oh, he says, you're not going to get a seat in the church tonight. He says, the church is full. He says, there's not a single seat left in the church. He said, maybe if you go over to the parish hall, they have overflow seating that they pipe it in on a closed circuit TV over in the parish hall. And he said, they might have a few seats left, but I doubt it. He says, there's been a lot of people there. I said, well, I just really wanted to go in just because I've never been here before, and I wanted to just see the inside of a church this old. And then he looked at me, and I will never forget, and he said to me, he said, you don't know what's going on here, do you? And I said, no. Okay. And then he said to me, and he said, the Blessed Virgin Mary appears in this church every Thursday night to a lady named Jonna Sullivan. And then he leans into my face like this, and he looks at me, and then he says, and it's real. Just like that. And I said, oh, okay. All right, that's nice to know. Now, I'm not saying I'm sitting here believing that. I'm hearing this for the first time ever. And then he said to me, he said, come on in here. Let me show you how we do things to people around here that we like. And he took...
He's wearing digging clothes.
I got holes in my knees.
Holes in his shoes.
Okay. He takes me in the church. Adoration is in progress. The Blessed Sacrament is exposed up on the altar. There's about 15, 20 people in the church.
It's a beautiful old church.
But where there was nobody sitting, people had books and pieces of paper with their names on it, and they had reserved their spot for the 7 o'clock rosary, apparition, chapel, divine mercy, and mass that started at 7 o'clock. Okay. And he said, let me show you how we do things around here. And he took me to the back right-hand pew, back row, right-hand pew. And he took all this stuff, women's coats and all this, and he slid everything down. This lady had her name written on a piece of paper. He took that, tore it in half, picked up her pencil that she had left in the pew, and he had me write my name on it. He took a piece of her Scotch tape off the piece that was holding her name tag on, and he stuck it on the back of the pew. And he said, now have a seat. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, this is nuts. Okay? So he went back outside. I stayed in because this is the first time I'd been to Eucharistic adoration since I was a kid. Okay? And I have to tell you that was beautiful. All right. So I'm in there, and I don't know how long I was in there. Half hour, 45 minutes, might have even been an hour. I don't know. I kind of lost track of time. But then I had to go to the bathroom. And I look around the church, and I'm looking for a restroom. And I didn't see one. So I walked back outside. That guy, Joe, is still sitting in his chair. And I said, and he said, you've been doing some serious praying, I see. You've been in there a long time. And I said, yeah. I said, I'm in the restroom. Oh. He said, you'll have to go across the street to the parish hall. And I said, oh, okay. He said, you got your name on your seat. You got, that's in there. He said, you're good. You're good. Sit down. Okay. I said, okay. So I walk across the street to go to the parish hall. And I use the restroom. And I come out of the restroom. And I'm thinking, I'm not going to be able to stay here. Because I still got to go to Gettysburg. I didn't have a cell phone in 1998. So I'm walking through the parish hall, St. Joseph's. And this other guy, who of course I've never met before because it's my first time there, gray-haired guy, nice looking guy, clean cut. And he comes walking up to me. He says, hey, how you doing? And I said, I'm doing good. He said, I don't think I've ever seen you here before. I said, no, you haven't. I said, this is the first time I've ever been here. He said, well, how did you hear about the apparitions here at St. Joseph's? I said, I didn't. I said, I just stopped by, and I said, the guy up on the front step over at the church, he told me. And then this guy, Larry, he started to explain the history and the whole story of the past 7 years of Our Lady appearing every Thursday night. And I listened to him, and I'm not saying that I believed everything that I was hearing, but I knew one thing right off the get-go is that the people that were telling me about it, they believed it. Because you could hear it in their voice, you could see it in their face, you could see it in their eyes. Just talking about it brought joy to their life. It was, okay? And I'm standing there talking to this guy, and then he really threw one at me. He said, hey, I need a little favor. You think you can help me out with something? And I said, sure. I'm thinking, carry some boxes, move some folding chairs or something. That's what I'm thinking. He said, I lead the 5th decade of tonight during the apparition of Our Lady. I mean, when he said that, and I hadn't prayed the rosary since I was a kid, and when he said that, I mean to tell you, I was going to say no. It was like, I'm thinking to myself, there's no way I'm going to do that. And I was going to say no. The word no had already formed, was already traveling up, and was ready to come out when all of the sudden, out of absolutely nowhere, in my mind, remember that bell tower a few hours earlier that startled me and it rang and I jumped back? That event replayed in my mind as loud and clear as when it originally happened, to the point it startled me for the second time. And I said, yes. And I'm thinking to myself, whoa. I mean, my head was spinning. And then after it finally stopped spinning, I asked myself, what have I got myself into? So he's telling me, he says, all you got to do, you know your Our Father, you know your Hail Marys, this, that, and the other. And you say, oh my Jesus, and everybody else will pick up after that. And then he said to me, he said, and if Our Lady comes, he said, she usually comes during the third or the fourth decade of the rosary. But sometimes she comes during the fifth, which I had the fifth. And he said, if she comes while you're leading the rosary, he says, you'll know, because if she hasn't come by the end of the fourth, she's coming during the fifth. I said, okay. And I'm thinking to myself, whoa, what have I got myself into? So I ended up spending the rest of the day there, and people kept pouring in and pouring in and pouring in. It got to the point where the church was down to absolute standing room only. And when you were in the church, to walk through the church, it was like you had to work your way elbow through elbow to go anywhere that it was that packed. People were lined up outside the church. Okay. The parish hall where they had the overflow was like packed, jammed. It was unbelievable. And I had my seat. Okay. And I was supposed to go up there and lead the fifth decade of the rosary. And I didn't want to wait until the fourth was over for me to go up, because it would take me forever to go from the back of the church to the front of the church through this crowd of people. So I start thinking, I don't, the first time here, I don't want to mess this up, and have people waiting for me to get up there. So I decided I was going to go up a little early, up against the left-hand side of the church, up along the wall, and work my way through the people. So that when my turn came, I only needed to take a few steps. I'd get up there and I'd say my Our Father and my 10 Hail Marys. Okay? There I was. The third decade. Lady was up there. I got up there just as the lady who was doing the third decade had finished. The lady that had the fourth decade of the rosary, she went up there and she started doing her part of the rosary. Okay. I am standing against the wall, as far away from the front pew, where there were like 4 or 5 priests, 2 nuns, and Jonna Sullivan, the lady who sees the Blessed Mother, and her husband, Dr. Michael Sullivan. Okay, they're in the front pew. Okay, I'm standing as far away from them as me to you. Right? We got to the eighth Hail Mary of the fourth decade of the rosary. And all of a sudden, I'm standing there. And this blue had a purplish tint of light flashed through the entire church. mean, it was like this flash. And then, you know how like if a bright light goes off in your eyes, it'll leave like a spot? It left this round ball of light, okay? And it drifted straight into the eyes of John Sullivan. And at the instant that ball of light touched her face, I mean, at the instant that light hit her face, was boom. That was the instant she went down on her knees and the apparition began. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God. And I'm standing there, and you've seen these cartoons where, you know, somebody's knees are knocking, okay? My knees were actually knocking to a point. I'd never experienced knocking knees before, but they were knocking. And I had to reach down, and I had to grab my knees and rub them like this. And then I had to lean back into the wall. I was like, good grief. And then there was a nun, Sister Genevieve Walsh, Sister Genevieve, sitting in a metal folding chair right up there at the front of the church. And she's as close to me as Father and I are right now. And she grabs my wrist and she said, son, are you all right? And I said, I think so. Okay. The apparition continued. Okay. Then the apparition ended. And Jonna went back from a kneeling position to sitting down in the pew that she was in. And then she took out, one of the priests handed her a pad of paper, and she stood there and she started writing down the message that Our Lady had given her. So the fourth decade ends. Now it's my turn to go and lead the fifth decade of the Rosary. And I have absolutely no recollection whatsoever of the transition of me being a nervous wreck with my knees knocking to all of a sudden, just, I went up there, I was just as calm and cool as a cucumber. I don't think there's anything on the planet Earth that could have disturbed me. I was completely at peace. I was not nervous. My knees were not knocking. And I led the fifth decade of the Rosary. The whole time she's sitting there writing down the message. Okay, so that ends. The Rosary ends, and then Father Kennedy starts Mass. And we had Mass. When that was over, okay, I walked up to this guy. Larry, I saw him walking my way, the guy that had asked me to do the fifth decade of the Rosary. And I said, let me ask you a question. He says, go ahead. He said, oh, by the way, he says, you did a really good job. I said, well, thank you very much. Okay. I said, but let me ask you a question. I said, did you see that purple, bluish flash of light at the instant of the apparition? He looked at me and he said, no. And one of the things that I had noticed, even before I asked him that, one of the things I had noticed was that when that flash of light came, I would have thought every single person in that church would have had a reaction to it. Because I don't know how you could see it and not have a reaction to it. Okay, he didn't see it. So I asked another guy, Joe Mark, the guy that had made my seat for me. Okay, I asked him if he saw it. No, I've Never seen anything like that. I said, oh, okay, all right. I'm in my digging clothes, my metal detector clothes. Okay, and I'm getting ready to go home. And then there's this old guy. He says to me, he said, young man, he said, do you need money for a new pair of shoes? And it's Ted. It was this guy named Ted Szymanski. Okay, he says, young man, he says, if you need money for a new pair of shoes and jeans, I'll give it to you right now. I said, no. I said, believe it or not, I do have better than this, but this, because I didn't know I was coming here. Okay, okay. And he says, okay. He said, well, can you do me a little favor? And I said, yeah. He said, I'm an old man. He said, can you help me across the street over here? Walk with me to the parish hall? I said, oh, yeah, I can do that. And I didn't know it at the time. But when everything was over on Thursday nights at St. Joseph's, because a lot of people came from a lot of different places, they had coffee and donuts for about a half hour. Okay, and people would go over there, get a cup of coffee, have a donut. It was a very nice little social type thing. All right. So that ends, and I'm thinking to myself, what a wonderful evening I've had. This has just been cool. I have loved this. All right. So I go home. I get home, it's after midnight, and Susan's got no idea where I'm at. I mean, she knew I was going to Gettysburg, but, she didn't know why I was this all, late, and I didn't pull over to call or anything. So, she said, when I walked into the bedroom, she says, where have you been? Because she was asleep, and she woke up, where have you been? And I simply was not ready to talk about it yet, because I hadn't finished letting it all settle in what that day had been. And I just simply said to her, I said, it's a long story. I'm going to have to tell you later. And then shockingly, she simply says, okay. And she rolls back over and goes back to sleep. Now, I'm thinking to myself, that in itself is a miracle. Okay? So, I went to bed. And I mean to tell you, never, ever, 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 not once in my life have I ever had a dream with Jesus Christ in it. And it went like this. I was standing outside, and I could see there was a lot of distance, probably looked like 20, 25 miles of pasture fields. And then what looked just like the Blue Ridge Mountains, like the way you'd see them in Culpeper from our house, that kind of distance away. Okay? And the sun was setting over the mountains, and it was a beautiful sunset, and the sun was sinking down below the mountain, and the rays of light were coming off of the sun. At the very instant that the top of the sun dipped down below the mountain, and now all you could see was the rays of light. The rays of light became even more spectacular. And all of a sudden, and this is like looking at, huge distance between where I'm standing and where this, all of a sudden, in the middle of those rays was a cross. Looked like it was about this big, okay? And then I looked closer in this dream, and I could see the knee bending out. I said, somebody's on that cross. And as soon as I said that in the dream, all of a sudden, it was like I was pulled, like this, like you could, you could feel the motion you were taking. It was like, you could feel like, it was like taking off in a jet, pressing you back in your seat. You know how that is? Okay. Like instantly, like from here to right there where that was. And I'm as far away from seeing Jesus Christ as I am from me to you. And I'm standing there, and Jesus is on the cross. He's wearing a purple cloth around himself. It was so close and so clear and so vivid that you could see each individual hair on his legs. There was no blood. There were nails. There was no blood. And I still don't quite understand the reaction that I had in this dream. But in this dream, I'm standing there and I'm jumping up and down and I'm pointing my finger at him and I'm saying, look, look, look who's there. And I didn't even know who I was talking to, but I sensed that there were people behind me. I didn't know that, but I sensed it. And then in the dream, I turned around to look and I saw that there was nobody there. And when I turned my head back towards Jesus, he was there. He was on the cross. And this sounds crazy, but this is the way it happened. He was nailed face into the cross. And now I'm looking at his back. And he turns around. He looks back over his shoulder. He does not say a word, but he looks at me, and then he gestures with his head 3 times, just like this. 3 times. Okay? And each time he did that, I knew he was saying, follow me. Okay? I woke up, and this would not have normally caught my attention, but it was such a seamless transition from going from the dream to waking up. And it was the first thing I saw after I woke up. It was the clock next to the digital clock next to the bed. And it was 3:33 a.m. in the morning. Okay. All right. Well, that didn't mean anything to me. All right. So, a week passes. I'm working 4-12 shift. This is a week later. And I just happened to look up at the clock in the computer room where I work. Just at the precise instant, the clock switched to 7 o'clock and 00 seconds. I was thinking, I'll go take my lunch break now. Looked up, 7 o'clock and 00 seconds. And I thought to myself, oh, that prayer group that I was at last weekend in Emmitsburg, it's starting right now. And I wanted to be there, but I was at work. And then I said to myself, I said, I'm going next week, and I am going to go every single week that I can. Okay? It was like I had this burning desire to get back. I mean, it was like, I need to get back there. Okay. So now another week passes. I drive to Emmitsburg. I go to St. Joseph's Church, and the same guy, Joe Martin, you'd love this guy if you ever met. He's passed away now, but he's a great guy. He's sitting there in his little folding chair, okay, and he's giving people passes and this, that, and he says, you're back. He said, something told me you were going to be back. He said, you're early enough today that there's still a few seats left in the church. I said, oh, good. He says, go on in there, get your seat before they're all gone. All right. I went in there and I picked out a seat, and I went through the day. Okay. I was gonna go to Gettysburg, which I never ended up going there again that day. I never made it. Okay, and then, there's no point going through that whole day, but now it's 7 o'clock and the prayer group is getting ready to start. I'm in my seat. And I mean to tell you, I had my eyes peeled. Now, Rosie was gone. I had my eyes peeled. I was looking at her and I was waiting for that bluish, purplish light. Okay? Well, the apparition began and it did not happen. Okay? It did not happen. Okay? And I'm thinking, okay, all right. And I didn't know if it was or not. All right. And when everything was over, I met that guy Ted for the second time in my life. And I helped him again over the parish hall. We had coffee, we had donuts. Okay. And then I got in my truck and I drove home. Walk in the house. I haven't said anything to Susan. Susan would be here from up hadn't had a medical emergency yet. I walk in the house, Susan's already, and she said, where have you? Remember, I had never told her about the first time. We had not discussed this yet. And I said, for the second, used the same words. I said, it's a long story. I'm just going to have to tell you about it later. And for the second time, she simply said, okay, and went back to sleep. And I'm thinking, well, goodness, that's just not how she normally would react, coming in 1 o'clock in the morning. All right. Now, for the second time in my life, I have another dream about Jesus. I go to bed, and in this dream, it is the darkest blackness you have ever seen in your life. And I mean, it's like, it's like if you were watching blackness in an IMAX theater. It almost like circles around your head. And it was so dark and so black. The blackness, the darkness looked like it even had a texture to it. And I remember it in the dream. I remember taking my hand and waving it in front of my eyes and not being able to see anything in front of my face. Nothing. Then all of a sudden, in the dead center of the darkness is this tiny pinpoint of light. And that tiny pinpoint of light, dead center of everything, of the darkness I'm seeing, dead center, starts coming towards me at a pretty good rate of speed, constant rate of speed, and it's getting closer and closer and closer. It looks like it's coming through the entire universe. As it got closer, the light got bigger. As the light got bigger, the darkness got smaller. Then it got to the point where it was close enough that you could see that it was the side profile of the face of Jesus wearing the crown of thorns, all made out of golden light. And it just kept coming and coming and coming and coming, to the point where I couldn't make out the features anymore because it just turned to all light. The field of vision was light, and it passed through me. And my reaction in dream was to turn around to see him going from behind me. But at the instant I turned around was the instant that I woke up, and there's the clock on the bed, next to the bed, and it's 3:33 in the morning, just like 2 weeks ago. when I had the dream. Okay. So I went 2 more weeks. I hadn't told anybody where I was going. And I just went by myself, like I had been. I hadn't told Susan yet. I hadn't told Mom yet. I hadn't told anybody. And I went for 2 more weeks. And then, after 2 weeks, I came home and Susan said, "Where have you been? Where have you, the questions were starting now. Where have you been on Thursday nights?" Okay. I said, "Okay." I said, "Sit down." I said, "I have a long story to tell you." And I tell Susan everything I've just told you. And she's sitting there, and I mean, she just looked like this. Just kind of like dumbfounded. And then she said, "Okay." I said, that's the truth. I said, "That's the way it is." And I invited her to go next Thursday night. And she says, "No, I don't think I want to go," which told me right off the get-go that she doesn't believe that story. Who wouldn't want to go to that?
Right.
Okay. So I'm thinking to myself, well, this is just something that God will have to fix. Because that, I'll do the best I can. But I went for the next 2 Thursday nights, and it was after those that I told him. And then I was on day shift, and I said to Susan, this was on a Thursday morning, I was getting ready to walk out the door to go to work. And I said, "Remember, tonight's Thursday night. I'm going to be going to Emmitsburg to the prayer group at St. Joseph's." And she had a fork in her hand, and she was standing at the kitchen sink, and she just threw it down into the sink, just like that. Water splashed everywhere. And she just looked at me and she said, "Fine." Just like that. "Oh, okay, it's all coming out now." Okay. And I said, and I'm thinking to myself, and she never accused me of this, but I know it was running in her mind.
You're not going to any prayer group.
Okay. I know she was thinking I had a Thursday night girlfriend somewhere. Okay. It had to have been. She swears to this day that never crossed her mind. She swears to this day that no, I never thought that. Okay. So I invited her to go the following Thursday. And she says, "No." And then Christopher butts in. He's sitting there eating his breakfast, getting ready to go to school. "I'll go, Daddy. I'll go. Let me go with you, Daddy." Okay. So I said, "Great." I said, "When I get off work at 4 o'clock, I said, I'll come home." I said, "You be ready, and you and I'll ride to Emmitsburg, and we'll go to the prayer group I was telling you about." "Oh, that sounds good, Daddy. Let's go." Okay, and Susan's like, okay, must not be a girlfriend or something because he's willing to take Christopher with him. Okay, so Christopher and I go to the Thursday night prayer group. This is Christopher's first time ever in there. All right, and that was the night, the first time when I got there and when the apparition started. I didn't see that light, but all of a sudden, at the instant the apparition started, I started smelling roses. Okay? And it was exactly like the night Christopher was baptized. Identical. Okay. So we go over and I have a cup of coffee, and we had some hot chocolate for Christopher. And then he and I drove home. And Susan's already gone to bed by the time we got there. She woke up and said, "Oh, y'all can tell me about it in the morning." Okay, and so Christopher's up, he's having breakfast, and now Christopher, 7 years old, is telling Susan the same thing I had been telling. And hearing it come out of his 7-year-old mouth, in his 7-year-old mind, description of what it was like, floored Susan. Floored her. Okay? And so then she said it was either that night or the next night, we were eating dinner, and she said, when you go to the Thursday night prayer group next time, this coming up Thursday, if you don't mind, I think I'll ride with you. And I said, I don't mind. I said, that's what I've been hoping and praying for. Okay? So, Thursday comes. Susan gets in the car, and she goes with us. She walks into St. Joseph's for the first time ever. Okay? And now she got to remember, she's Southern Baptist. My wife is Southern Baptist. Okay? And a hardcore Southern Baptist mother. Okay? Susan was just Southern Baptist. Her mom, hardcore. Okay. So Susan goes, and the apparition begins. And when the apparition would begin, you could hear a pin drop in that church, even though it was packed full of people. You could hear a pin drop. And I'm in there in the church. I'm kneeling down because the apparition has started. And I found, and I look over, and tears are streaming down Susan's face. And this is during the time that Our Lady's actually appearing. Tears are streaming down her face. I didn't say anything, and I just looked back and I'm thinking, okay. Everything ends, and it's now time to go over to the parish hall to have a cup of coffee. And we're walking out of the church. And as we're walking out of the church, Susan grabs me with both hands by the arm. And she just looks at me and she says, I love you. I love you too. And then she didn't say anything else. And most of the way home, she was trying to learn the Hail Mary and the Glory Be. She was reading it off of this piece of paper that somebody had given her. All right. And then later that very week, I come home for lunch from work, and she's on the phone. Okay. And she had signed herself our CIA classes at Precious Blood. She said, now I'm not saying I'm going to do it, but I'll go and I'll listen. Okay. She went through and she converted. Okay. So by this time, now I had to call Mom, and I had to tell my mom about this. And my mom says, what? Okay. And I told her everything that I've just told y'all now up to this point. And then she says, well, I want to go. And I said, okay. I said, I'll take you. And so now we're going up on Thursday. You still hadn't started coming yet.
I was watching y'all.
Okay.
I was taking it all in, thinking, they're all touched now.
Okay. So now I've got Susan, I've got Christopher, and I've got my mom. Okay. And we would go, and it was great. It was absolutely great. Mom was thrilled about it because she said, what I couldn't accomplish in a lifetime, the Blessed Mother has whipped him into shape in 3 months.
Mom said she remembered she sat in precious blood praying to God. I want to see my children in church, and I don't want to be dead when it happens. She said within 2 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So then, Susan goes through her RCIA classes, and it's now coming up on Easter of the year 2000. And Susan had made friends with this nun who was there. Her name was Sister Claire Mahoney. And Sister Claire was, she was always there. She was one of the Daughters of Mercy. And Susan and Sister Claire become friends, and they would sit there over in the parish hall before everything started, and they would talk for an hour or so. And Sister Claire was very helpful in getting her through RCIA and getting her into the Catholic Church. And Sister Claire did an absolutely wonderful job. Well, right before Easter of the year 2000, we went up there for the Thursday night prayer group. Let me back up 1 week before that. We're sitting at the kitchen at our house in Culpeper. We're having dinner. And Monsignor Hugh Phillips, he's dead now, but at the Thursday night prayer group, he had enrolled me in the brown scapular, which I still wear today. Okay? And Susan and I and Christopher are sitting there eating dinner, and Susan asked me about the brown scapular. She said, that brown scapular that priest gave you, what is that? And I explained the brown scapular to the best of my limited ability. And she says, oh, that's nice. And then she asked, and she said, well, are there any other kinds of scapular? And I said, yeah. I said, there's several others. I said, there's a green scapular. I said, I don't know what it's about. And I said, there's a white scapular and a blue scapular. And I said, and there's a red scapular. And then she stopped me and she said, when I become a Catholic in a couple of weeks, if I were to wear a scapular, because it was for the Passion of Christ, she says, I think I would want to wear a red scapular. And I said, okay, that's nice, that's good. And that kind of showed me that her heart was in the right place for somebody getting ready to go from Southern Baptist to Catholic. The next night, 24 hours later, we go to the Thursday night prayer group. It's me, Susan, it's Christopher, and it's Mom. Were you there that night? No, you weren't there yet. Okay. Sister Claire, the prayer group had ended, the apparition was over, everything was over, okay? And we're walking out of the church, and Sister Claire stops us on the front steps of St. Joseph's Church. And Sister Claire said to Susan, don't go anywhere, Susan, don't go anywhere. I have something for you, and I need to give it to you tonight because I'm going to be out of town, and I'm not going to be here for the next 2 weeks because I'm going to be wherever it was that she was going to be. She says, Susan, you wait right here. And she says, I have a small gift for you for coming into the Catholic Church on Easter. So we're standing outside on the front steps of St. Joseph's Church. Sister Claire, there was a little habit that people had of taking objects to have them blessed, because Our Lady had said during one of her apparitions at St. Joseph's that after the priest had blessed objects, that she will come behind the priest after they've done it first and give her motherly blessing. So people would pile stuff up underneath the statue of the Virgin Mary. And that's where whatever this gift was sitting. And Sister Claire was going to go get it now that everything was over. And she comes out and she says, hands it to Susan, it's all wrapped up. And Sister Claire said, go ahead and open it now. So Susan opened it, and it was a beautiful, heavy, high quality statue of Jesus as the Good Shepherd with the lamb on his shoulder. And what do you think was draped around the shoulders of the statue of Jesus as the Good Shepherd? Was the red scapular. I mean to tell you, we have never in our entire life ever had a conversation about the red scapular or any scapular whatsoever. And then the one night that we did, the very next night at the apparition of Mary at St. Joseph's, that conversation materialized into reality right on the front steps of St. Joseph's Church. And Susan was like stunned. I was stunned. And I said, I didn't say anything. You know, it was like one of those kind of moments. Okay. So also, okay, it goes even deeper. Also in the box that Sister Claire had given her was a pair of very nice, high quality rosary beads. Silver. Okay? Susan starts to cry. And she's, thank you, Sister Claire. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay? And then we go home. We go to the parish hall. We go home. And by this time, Ted Szymanski's riding with us. He lived in Leesburg, Virginia, so now we're picking him up every Thursday night.
Piling into his car.
Piling into his car because it was bigger. Okay? But Susan came into the Catholic Church on the Easter Vigil of the year 2000. The following Thursday was the first apparition that had taken place at St. Joseph's since Easter. And Susan took her rosary that Sister Claire had given her. And during the apparition, the rosary that Sister Claire had given her turned to gold. I cannot sit here and explain this to you, but the rosary turned from silver to gold. And then come to find out, that happens a lot over in Medjugorje. Okay? Well, to my knowledge, Susan's and Joe Martin, the guy at the front door, they're the only two people I know of that their rosaries turned to gold during one of the apparitions there. Okay. Now, there's something else that you have to know to start to understand why we're sitting here now. I'm telling you all this. Okay. It was a very unusual and strange thing that started happening to me. And that was, remember I told you the first night I went, I had that first dream, Jesus nailed to the cross. I woke up and it was 3:33 in the morning. 2 weeks later, I went back. I had the second dream of the light. I wake up, it's 3:33 in the morning. Okay, after that started happening, okay, I started to notice that every single Thursday, when we arrived at St. Joseph's Church, we would arrive and the time on the dash of the car would be 333. Okay? And then this would happen every single week. Even if you left at a different time, road construction, this, that, or the other, okay? And then it would happen every single time. And then sometimes, okay, one time it happened, okay? It didn't happen. I looked down and it wasn't 333. And then I looked down and I just happened to notice the odometer on the car was 333. And this would happen every single time. Now, if it wasn't the time, if it wasn't the odometer, at the very instant that we would arrive at St. Joseph's Church, an oncoming car coming from the opposite direction, just as we got, St. Joseph's is right here, just as we got here and the other car oncoming, here's Joseph. As soon as we got to the very front of St. Joseph's, here comes an oncoming car with the license plate of 333. And it happened every single time we would arrive. And even if you tried to make it not happen, it would still happen. Okay, and this went on, and this went on. And then we would drive home. We would pull in the driveway at our house in Culpeper, 110 miles away. And whatever hour it was, the minutes were 33. And the odometer would be 333 at the instant that we got home. This went on and on. Okay. And then I was like, I'm not going to say I was spooked by it, but I sure as heck didn't know what was going on. But I kept thinking of those dreams and the way that happened. So this one particular Thursday night, it was during the apparition. Okay, I made a special prayer to Our Lady as she was appearing to John in the church, and I said, "Blessed Mother," I said, any doubt that I had that you're here is gone. I said, I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever, and thank you very much. And then I said, and this was just not like me, I said, Blessed Mother, I said, you've got the hardest job of anybody who's ever lived on earth. I said, going through all you went through with the crucifixion of your son, and I said, and the hard work you had to go through, and I said, and even now, 2,000 years later, you're still tirelessly working to save some rotten jerk like me. Okay? And then I said this. I said, this sounds nuts, but this is what I said in my prayer. This is just my feeble mind while something like this is going on. I said, the Blessed Mother, I said, there's not a whole lot I can do. I said, but I know you're here. I said, I know you're here. And because of that, I'm offering you anything that I could ever do for you that would help you make your life a little bit easier. I'm willing to do it. And then I said, one other thing. I said, every time I arrive at St. Joseph's, and in my prayer, I explained the 333 thing to her. Okay? At the instant that I finished that prayer, the apparition ended, the rosary continued, and we drove home. I don't remember the details, but I guarantee you when we got there, it was 333 or 33. Okay? But before we left, as we were leaving, Sister Claire, the same Sister Claire that gave Susan the rosary and the statue of Jesus, said, "Robert, do you have one of these?" And I looked at it and I said, "No." And she goes, "Well, this is for you." And it was a book, thick blue book, and it was the messages given to Father Stefano Gobi from 1972 to 1999. And I said, "No," I said, "I've never seen this book before." And she said, "Well, I want you to have it." I said, "Okay." So I took the book home. I set it in the living room when we got home. I set it on the living room table. That would have been Thursday night. It wasn't until the following Wednesday that I picked it up again. Okay, and I picked it up and I'm just thumbing through it. I've never seen this book. And I opened up just at random to page 610. And on page 610, there was a message that was given to Father Stefano Gobi, who's now up for sainthood, by the Blessed Mother. And the title of the message was The Mark of the Beast. And in this message, the Blessed Mother explained to the Marian movement of priests, of which Father Gobi was the head one, about the Antichrist. And she went on to break down what each number means for the number 666. Okay? And instead of going through what all that means, just know that that's what she said. And then she said, but the ancient serpent, or the devil, Satan, places himself higher than God. Therefore, my son number is 333. This is Father Gobi, Blessed Mother of Father Gobi. And then she goes on to say that the number 333 deals with the unity of the Trinity. The second 3 deals with the passion, the suffering, and the death of her son Jesus. And that the third 3 is his resurrection. 3 days. Third day. Okay? And she said that Satan, of course, wants to place himself higher, so he goes by 666 to double that number. Okay. But I read this, opening that book up at random and landing right on that page and reading that about the 333. And at the instant that I finished reading it, I glanced at my watch and it was 3:33 and 33 seconds that day, that instant. Okay. So then we drive to, let me back up a little bit. I go to bed at night. After that happened, I'd go to bed at night and I would fall asleep and I would wake up, not every night, but 3 to 4 times a week. And I would be saying the Our Father. Sometimes I was saying prayers in a dream that I never even heard of before, but I knew the words in the dream. Okay? And they were beautiful prayers, but I couldn't tell you what they said now. Or even, I don't think I could have 5 seconds after I woke up. But every time that happened, I would wake up and it would be 3:33 in the morning. And this went on. And then, all of a sudden, it stopped. Just like that. The next Thursday night, when we went to St. Joseph's, we arrived, and instead of it being 3:33, or the odometer being 3:33, or a license plate from an opposite car coming 3:33, okay, it all changed, and it became 13:13. Okay, and this went on every single week. We would arrive, and it would be 3:13, or it might be 4:13, or the odometer 13. Without fail, we would drive home, and we'd pull in the driveway, and it would be 13 minutes after the hour. The odometer would be 13, and sometimes you would get the 3:33 or the 13th, whatever. Sometimes you would get all three of them simultaneously. It's happened before a lot of times where you would arrive at St. Joseph's. The time was 3:33, the odometer was 3:33, and the car coming from the opposite direction. All three, just like boom, all together, instantly. Unbelievable. You couldn't time this or make this happen in a million years. Okay, so now everything is stopped with the 3:33s, and everything is switched to 13. All right. All of a sudden, I would start waking up at night, praying a Hail Mary, and I would wake up halfway through the Hail Mary. I started it in my sleep. I'm continuing it as I wake up, and I'd look over, and it'd be 3:13 in the morning. Mm-hmm. And this went on and on and on for a couple of months. And then all of a sudden it changed again. And it changed to where I arrived at St. Joseph's, and it would be 50% of the time it would be 3:33, 33. Same thing I've just described to you. Or it would be 13, just the way I've described to you. 50% of the time. It's always one of the two. Okay. So I go back to Father Gobi's book, and just by random, I'm reading that the Blessed Mother chose the 13th of the month to appear at Fatima, because 13 is the number that represents the Trinity. One God and three divine persons. And then she went on to say that it is Satan who tries to distort that number. Okay? It's truly her, but Satan tries to distort it and associate it with the occult. Okay?
I'm sorry, I got a funeral reception to do. I waited till the last minute. I thought, this okay, I can't, maybe I'll hear it on my way there.
All right, that's fine.
I'm so sorry.
That's all right. So this went on, and it still happens to this day. If I leave here today and I drive to Emmitsburg and I arrive at St. Joseph's, it's going to be 100% of the time 3:33, 33, or 13 when I get there.
It's not just then when it happens. It happens more.
So, right. Well, it happens a whole lot more. Okay. So, it really starts to get even more unusual. back in, 2003, and by this time, the Archdiocese of Baltimore had closed down the Thursday night prayer group at St. Joseph's. And it stopped. But then it started up again on private property. And we would go to that, and this same exact thing would continue. Okay? And so then I was at home one day, and this would have been in late 2002 or very early 2003. And I would have a dream, and I would wake up from the dream, and it would be 13 minutes. If I looked over at the clock, it would be 13 minutes. And the dream was move to Emmitsburg. I just brushed it off, but it continued to happen. And then I would start praying the rosary about it. I could be out in the woods, and all of a sudden, boom, this feeling would just hit me. And it was the same feeling that I recognized from when the apparition was taking place in St. Joseph's. And I would pray the rosary, and I would look at my watch when I started, and it would be 13 minutes after the hour or 33 minutes after the hour. And then I would have the urge or the thought of maybe playing with the idea of moving to Emmitsburg. And then with that would come the Center Roses. And then it just happened so much that that I couldn't ignore it. So I brought it up to Susan, and I mentioned it to her, and she was, yep, let's go. All right. So we decided to move to Emmitsburg. We bought a house up there, and when we were backing out of the driveway to head to Emmitsburg for the last time, the house was now, we didn't sell it, we rented it, but we weren't coming back to it. It was our trip to Emmitsburg. I remember looking at the house from the street, and I said, it's been a good house. I've enjoyed living there. And I said, we're not going to live here anymore. And then all of a sudden, that same voice that said, no, this is just the beginning, exactly the same way, boomed through me and said, no, for 5 years. I think, well, but I knew it was the same. I recognized it. So we went up there and we lived for 5 years. And then the Thursday night prayer group, which was now taking place on private property, stopped. The Blessed Mother stopped it. At that point, we decided we tried to sell our house in Culpeper and it didn't sell. But we decided to move back to Culpeper. And so we moved back in 2009. And we were there 5 years and 3 days. Okay? Like last time we were pulling out of the right? No, for 5 years.
So it was 5 years and days?
5 years and 3 days. Okay. So, at that point, now, I'm just going to tell you this because this is just the way it happened. We moved up there, and it was Feast of the Immaculate Conception, December the 8th, 2004. We had lived up there now about 2 months. We were there I have to look back, but it was about two months or so. And I had just taken a new job, same company, Swift, who I'm retired from. And on December the 7th, I was having a very unusual day. Whereas this thing with the scent of roses was happening to me a lot that day. And I got off work and I drove back to Emmitsburg. And I had forgotten that St. Joseph's, because when I got to St. Joseph's, which is on my way home, the lights were on. And I said, oh, they're having the vigil mass for the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. Okay, so I said, and I was tired that night. I was tired. And I called Susan. I said, hey, you want to go to Mass at St. Joseph's for tomorrow? You want to do it tonight? And she says, no, I'm too tired. I'm going to go tomorrow. She said, but if you want to go tonight, go ahead and go. I said, all right. I said, I'm tired. I'm going to go tonight. So I arrived at St. Joseph's that night at 7:13. Mass started at 7:33.
Marion Barnes is the host now. Robert Coley is the host now.
And at the instant he did, that same feeling of peace, which I don't think I mentioned this to you, that same feeling of peace that you get during the apparition while it was taking place in St. Joseph's, and the night I said thanks for nothing, the night Christopher was beat up, that same feeling at the instant he placed the host on my tongue, there it was. I'm experiencing it again. And I glanced at my watch. 8:13 and 33 seconds. Okay. Whoa. Mass ended. I drove home. And I told Susan I was kind of tired. And she said that she wasn't feeling good, that she felt like she was getting ready to come down with something. So she was going to sleep in the guest room. So I went upstairs and I went to bed. Susan drug her pillow into the guest room. And then I go to bed. I go to sleep. I wake up all of a sudden praying a Hail Mary. I looked over at the clock, and it was 3:33 in the morning. All right. If you get up and walk out of here when I tell you this, I don't blame you. Okay. All of a sudden, this brilliant white light flashed in the room. And it filled my entire field of vision with absolutely nothing but this white light. You couldn't see anything around the edges of the white light. Every centimeter of vision was this white light. Bright, but not blinding. And then all of a sudden, just like, bang, there she was, right in the middle of that white light. And she did not say a word. She just smiled. And she had this kind of smile on her face that was like coming from the inside out, is the best way I can put it. It was like every part of her being was just radiant. And she had a veil on that was blowing in the wind. And she just looked at me and she just smiled. And then, just as quick as it came, it was gone. I looked over at the clock in shock at the last a second, it was 333 and switched to 334. At the last fraction of a second. And at that point, my life has never been the same since. So there's a lot of people that I took to the Thursday night prayer group at St. Joseph's. Some of them thanked me and said, yeah, that was good. I like that. And a lot of people returned to church because of it. Okay. Other people have said to me, I can't believe you fell for that crap. I've had people tell me that. Okay.
Well, it was definitely a different place when you went.
Okay. But when somebody says, I can't believe you fell for that crap, what I experienced was too powerful to let something like that insult me. I couldn't, it just didn't bother me. Okay. So here we go. This is the last segment of what I'm going to tell you. This is the last. Okay, ever since that happened, it's never happened again